Most people think the mortgage question is a math question. Should I pay off the house early or should I invest the extra money instead? It sounds clean, it sounds rational, it sounds like the kind of question that should produce one correct answer if you just find the right spreadsheet. But that is not what this question really is. It is a life structure question disguised as a rate comparison, because once you move beyond the surface, you realize very quickly that this decision is not just about return. It is about volatility, it is about inflation, it is about flexibility, it is about sequence risk, it is about whether you want the next 20 years optimized for growth or made more durable against bad luck. And those are not the same thing. That is why intelligent people can look at the same mortgage and come to different conclusions without either one being foolish. The real issue is not whether one side is morally superior. The real issue is what kind of future you are trying to build. So let me start with the pure math, because the math does matter. Every extra dollar you send to your mortgage earns a guaranteed return equal to your mortgage rate. That is the cleanest part of the whole discussion. If your mortgage costs 6%, then paying it down is the equivalent of earning a guaranteed 6% return on that dollar, because that interest expense disappears. No taxes on the return, no volatility, no bad quarter, no terrifying year where the market is down 30% and your return has become a sick joke. A mortgage payment made early is certainty that is powerful, but there's another truth on the other side. If that same extra dollar were invested instead, history suggests it may earn more over a long enough period. Not guaranteed, not smoothly, but possibly more. That is why the argument never dies. You are comparing guaranteed savings to uncertain but historically stronger growth, and the spread between those two outcomes is where the whole decision lives. Now, once you begin looking at actual data rather than emotional slogans, a pattern emerges. There are really three broad zones. The first is the keep, the mortgage zone. This is usually when your rate is somewhere around 0 to 4% in this zone. The mathematical case for investing is often very strong, especially if you have a long runway. Why? Because a 2%, 3%, or 4% mortgage is not just cheap. It gets cheaper with time. That is the part many people fail to respect. A fixed mortgage does something almost magical in an inflationary world. The payment stays fixed, your wages, prices, and the whole nominal economy tend to rise over time. So the burden of the payment shrinks relative to your income and relative to the cost of everything else. That means a 3% mortgage is not just a low borrowing cost. It is a decaying obligation year after year. You are paying it back with dollars that are worth slightly less, while your earning power, if your life is progressing normally, is hopefully moving higher. That is a beautiful setup. When people kill a 3% mortgage aggressively, they often feel virtuous. Sometimes they are simply destroying one of the cheapest pieces of long-term leverage they will ever hold in their life. And cheap leverage, when attached to a useful asset like a home and managed responsibly, can be a gift. Now, I am not telling you that every low-rate borrower should worship debt. I am telling you that a low-rate fixed mortgage is not the same as ugly debt. It does not behave like a credit card. It does not behave like a bad car loan. It does not behave like revolving consumer sludge. A mortgage at 2%, 3%, or 4% sits in a very different category. That is why the numbers so often favor investing in that zone. If broad equities can reasonably return more over time, if even a balanced portfolio can plausibly out-earn the mortgage rate over a long horizon, and if inflation is quietly shrinking the real cost of the debt anyway, then paying that mortgage off early can mean giving up a very attractive spread. That is the first zone. The second zone is the gray zone, roughly 4 to 6%. This is where the internet gets stupid because it still wants a simple answer, but the clean answer begins to disappear here. The spread narrows, taxes matter more, behavior matters more, volatility matters more, your account type matters more, your age matters more, your tolerance for uncertainty matters more, and your plan, fragility, matters much more than people realize. A 5.5% mortgage against a 5 to 6% after tax expected return is not some obvious slam dunk at that point. The extra return is thin enough that you must start asking a better question. What exactly am I taking risk for? Because when the spread is small, the decision is no longer really about maximizing upside. It becomes about whether the upside premium is worth the stress, timing risk, and structural fragility you are accepting in exchange. That is a much more adult question. And then there is the third zone, the pay it off zone. Once the mortgage rate gets into the 6% range and beyond, the logic begins to shift much more forcefully. because now the guaranteed return from paying it down is hard to replace elsewhere without taking meaningful risk. A 6.5% mortgage, for example, is not just a liability. It is a compounding headwind. Every extra payment is removing a headwind that is strong enough to compete with what many reasonable portfolios can deliver after taxes and after volatility. That is why paying it off starts becoming less of an emotional preference and more of a mathematically respectable default, especially once you are older and age matters here more than almost anything else. A 35-year-old and a 45-year-old do not inhabit the same mortgage decision, even if they have the same rate. That is one of the most overlooked truths in personal finance. The younger person has something incredibly valuable: time to recover from bad markets, time to ride through volatility, time to let compounding overpower multiple bad years, time to allow capital gains, dividends, and reinvestment to keep building before retirement withdrawals ever begin. That is why a 35-year-old with a 6.5% mortgage may still rationally lean more heavily toward investing than someone much older would, because the compounding runway is so long that the opportunity cost of underinvesting can become enormous. $1 invested at 35 is not the same as $1 invested at 45. A decade matters, not in theory, in outcome. That is what people underestimate. They think the mortgage decision is only about the rate. It is also about the age of the dollar. A dollar invested at 35 has decades to work. A dollar invested at 45 has less time, less flexibility, and a shorter recovery horizon if things go badly. That is why the same mortgage rate can produce different correct answers for different people. Let me show you how I think about the 35-year-old. If I am 35 with a 6.5% mortgage, I am in a place where I want to protect compounding first, but I do not want to ignore the guaranteed return of the debt either. I am not yet trying to create the most bulletproof retirement shell possible. I am still in the long phase where growth matters enormously. So if my cash flow allows it, I want my tax-advantaged accounts filled. I want my broad market exposure intact. I want my long runway respected, but I may still send some additional money toward the mortgage because 6.5% is no joke. In other words, I do not want to pretend it is either all mortgage or all market. I want to split. I want a system that protects the compounding engine while also taking bites out of an expensive liability. That is how an adult handles a gray zone decision. Now compare that to the 45-year-old. This is where the center of gravity starts moving. Why? Because now retirement is no longer a distant abstraction. Now you are closer to the phase where fixed expenses can do real damage. You are closer to the phase where sequence of returns risk begins to matter far more. You are closer to the phase where large market losses combined with a still heavy mortgage can make the whole plan more fragile than the spreadsheet suggested. That is why I become more sympathetic to paying the mortgage down aggressively in the 40s. Even if I do not go fully all in at 45, every dollar still deserves growth. But durability starts demanding a louder voice. This is the shift many people miss. The decision is not static. The decision ages. A mortgage strategy that was intelligent at 3, the 5th of may be only partially intelligent at 45 and possibly foolish by 58, depending on the rest of the plan, because as retirement approaches, your problem changes. You are no longer simply trying to build the largest pile. You are trying to make the pile survive. And one of the simplest ways to make a retirement plan more survivable is to reduce fixed expenses before the portfolio has to start feeding them. That is why I sometimes say this entire question is not really about the interest rate, it is about fragility. Does this debt make my life structurally more fragile if I lose my job? What happens if markets fall? What happens if retirement arrives into a bad sequence? What happens if inflation stays sticky but my withdrawals start? What happens a low-rate mortgage with big cash reserves and a long horizon is not especially fragile? A higher-rate mortgage attached to someone approaching retirement with thin margins can be very fragile. That is the difference. Now let us deal with another important layer. After-tax returns. People compare mortgage rates to market returns too casually. They hear stocks return 7 to 10% over time and assume the comparison is settled. Not so fast. What matters is what you keep. Dividends may be taxed, capital gains may be taxed, portfolio turnover can create drag, state taxes may matter, and your account type matters enormously. Money invested inside a Roth or tax, deferred retirement account behaves differently from money invested in a taxable account. So that 7% or 8% headline return may not actually show up in your life as a 7% or 8% effective advantage over the mortgage. This is why the spread narrows as rates climb. And once the spread narrows, guaranteed return becomes much more attractive. A guaranteed 6.5% is not equal to an uncertain 6.5%. One of those numbers is a wall. The other is a weather forecast. Now let us get even more practical. People want a single answer because single answers feel clean. But one of the most underappreciated strategies in personal finance is the hybrid. You do not have to choose one religion, you can split. That is often the wisest move in the gray zone. You keep funding the market. You keep compounding alive, but you also direct extra dollars to principal. So the mortgage ends years sooner, the interest bill falls meaningfully, and your future fixed cost burden gets smaller. This does two things that matter enormously. It reduces regret and it preserves flexibility. Regret matters more than people admit. The person who sends every dollar to the mortgage and misses a decade of compounding may regret it. The person who sends every dollar into the market and still carries a large mortgage into retirement may regret that. A hybrid reduces the odds that either regret grows poisonous, and flexibility matters because life changes. Job changes, health changes, family obligations change, markets change. The best plan is rarely the one with the most mathematically elegant spreadsheet. It is the one you can survive across multiple futures. That is why I like hybrid thinking so much. Now, let me talk about peace of mind because I refuse to treat it as irrational. Peace of mind is not a silly factor, it is a real factor. The internet tends to sneer at it because peace of mind is hard to quantify. I do not care. Some people sleep better when the house is free and clear. Some people feel physically calmer knowing they cannot be forced to make that payment again. Some people think better when they owe less. Some marriages function better when debt is lower. Some households simply operate with more confidence when shelter is no longer tied to a bank. That matters. You cannot dismiss it just because it does not fit neatly into a rate comparison formula. But you also cannot let peace of mind become a cover story for mathematically destructive behavior without at least looking directly at the trade-off. That is why I say the decision must be both informed and personal. Use the data, then use your own life. There is no virtue in maximizing theoretical return if the strategy leaves you feeling exposed in a way that damages your judgment or stability. There's also no virtue in killing a very cheap mortgage early if doing so starves the best compounding years of your life. That is not prudence. That may just be expensive discomfort avoidance. So what is my actual framework? Very low mortgage rate, long horizon, good liquidity, strong discipline, comfortable with volatility, lean toward investing, higher mortgage rate, closer to retirement. Fixed expenses already feel heavy. Resilience matters more than maximizing upside. Lean toward paying it off, gray zone mortgage, decent runway, real desire for both growth and control, split the difference. That is the honest answer. Not because I am afraid to choose, because reality is layered. And the right choice is the one that strengthens your life, not just your spreadsheet at the end of the day. The question is not which side wins the debate. The question is, which decision makes my financial life less fragile, more aligned with the future I actually want to live? That is the only answer that matters. And once you ask it that way, the noise starts disappearing. You stop performing personal finance, you start building it.